Seconds after takeoff from Los Angeles, a fire erupts in the engine of a British Airways Boeing 747 carrying over 350 passengers. But incredibly, the pilots don't return to the airport. Instead, they decide to continue their journey to London, a decision which would soon lead to more problems. This is the controversial story of British Airways Flight 268. On the night of February 20th, 2005, 352 passengers and 18 crew boarded a British Airways Boeing 747 at Los Angeles International Airport in the United States. They were bound for London's Heathrow Airport, a journey that would take about 11 hours. Given the length of the flight, there were 3 pilots on board: a captain sitting in the left-hand seat, a first officer sitting in the right-hand seat, and another first officer sitting in one of the jump seats behind the 2 pilots. This additional first officer would take over from each of the pilots during the cruise, allowing them each to get some rest. The aircraft they were using was a 16-year-old Boeing 747-400. Despite having been introduced in 1989, the aircraft was still pretty modern in 2005. In the cockpit, the hundreds of mechanical dials in the previous iteration of the 747 had been replaced by CRT displays, which presented the same information in a more relevant and accessible way, and which did away with the need for a flight engineer. Especially at night, the cockpit looked like something out of Star Trek. And by the way, if you're a fan of Star Trek, or sci-fi in general, then you'll really enjoy this week's sponsor, Star Trek Fleet Command. Star Trek Fleet Command is an award-winning 4X MMO game set in the ever-expanding Star Trek universe. I like how there's a tactical element to the game. You can battle against people from around the world, negotiate alliances, and harvest the galaxy's resources as you upgrade your fleet of starships. There's no Boeing 747, but there are powerful ships like the USS Enterprise, the Romulan Warbird, and the Klingon Bird of Prey, which you can use to explore and conquer the galaxy. The multiplayer element really brings a competitive aspect to the game, which I enjoy, and the fact that different people play in different ways means that each battle is unique and engaging. The fact that you can switch seamlessly between PC and mobile without losing your progress is another aspect of the game that I like a lot. As part of your mission, you can recruit iconic characters from over 50 years of Star Trek history, including the original series, The Next Generation, the J.J. Abrams films, Discovery, and more, like Kirk, Spock, Michael Burnham, and Data. Every month, more content is added to the game, so there's always something new to do. This month, there's a host of new features, including Wave Defense. This introduces a new way for you to socially interact, which transcends alliances. With Wave Defense, you can defend a central point from waves of increasingly powerful enemies. Collaboration is the key to success. Star Trek Fleet Command is available on both PC and mobile. Install the game for free by scanning my QR code here if you're on PC, or tap the link in the video description and become a leader of a mighty alliance. If you're new to the game, then use my special promo code, WARPSPEED, to get a content pack for free. But remember that this is available only for new players. It was a murky, rainy night at LAX, and as was customary, things weren't looking much better in the UK. The pilots decided to take on an extra 4 tons of fuel, just in case there were delays on their arrival into London. This brought their total fuel weight for the trip up to 119 metric tons. Once all of the passengers had boarded and the baggage was loaded, Flight 268 pushed back from the gate at Los Angeles. The time was about 10 minutes past 9. The first officer taxied the aircraft out to runway 24 left at LAX. He would be flying the plane for this trip back to the UK, while the captain acted as pilot monitoring. So far, everything was going to plan. In the cabin, the passengers settled in for the long overnight flight. Most of them would be trying to get some sleep before arriving in London the next day. Nobody, neither passengers nor crew, foresaw what would happen just seconds after the plane got airborne. Just after 20 past 9, the first officer lined up on the runway and pushed the jumbo's massive engines to take off thrust. The 747 accelerated down the runway, and just over a minute later, the first officer pulled it into the sky. Then, it happened. Just after the captain moved the gear handle, a loud repetitive thumping sound shook the aircraft. The first officer felt the aircraft swing to the left. He pushed the right rudder to correct this. Passengers could see flames shooting out from under the aircraft's left wing. Immediately, the pilots saw the problem. The inboard engine on the left-hand side, engine number 2, had started surging. An engine surge happens when there is a disruption in the airflow through the engine. The loud bangs which could be heard were from the engine backfiring. The pilots could see the exhaust gas temperature rising to dangerous levels on their instruments. They needed to act fast. The captain brought the throttle for engine 2 back towards the idle position. At that moment, the controller in the tower at LAX told the pilots that he could see flames shooting out from behind the engine. As the captain brought the throttle back, the thumping sound stopped. The captain had experienced an engine surge in flight before, but the two other pilots had only experienced it in the simulator. While this was frightening, it was not an emergency per se. The 747 has 4 engines, and can fly very well on just 3. But if a fire developed in the engine, or if whatever had caused the surge began to affect the other engines, the pilots would need to declare an emergency. The captain declared a pan-pan to air traffic control. This is one step below declaring an emergency. It signals that the pilots need help and that their situation is urgent. However, it falls short of declaring that the lives of the occupants are under imminent threat. The controller directed the pilots to turn so that they could stay close to the airport. He also told them to climb to 5,000 feet so that they would have some space to sort out their issues. The 11-hour flight was not off to a good start. After a few minutes, with the aircraft stable at 5,000 feet, the pilots began planning their next steps. The best case scenario would be if they could get the engine running properly again. The captain passed the quick reference handbook to the first officer sitting in the jump seat behind him. He began to read out the items for the captain to perform, while the main first officer flew the aircraft. First, the captain selected continuous ignition on engine 2, ensuring that there was a constant supply of ignition for the engine. Then, he slowly advanced the throttle. The pilots were hoping that they would gradually be able to coax the engine back to full power. But as soon as the captain pushed the throttle forwards, the thumping noise resumed. It looked like they weren't going to be able to restart the engine. But there was still a chance that there just wasn't enough air getting into the engine. After all, a surge is caused when the delicate mixture of fuel, air and ignition is out of proportion. Just in case, the first officer increased the aircraft's speed, hoping that the increased flow of air into the engine would give it something to work with. Again, the captain carefully advanced the throttle for engine number 2, but just like it had the previous time, the sputtering resumed. The pilots had no choice. There was something seriously wrong with the engine. They would not be able to restart it. Reluctantly, the captain brought the throttle to idle and cut off the fuel supply to the engine. Engine 2 wound down. Flight 268 was now flying on 3 engines. With the technical part of the troubleshooting out of the way, the pilots now had a different decision tree to work through. And for this, they would draw not mainly on checklists, but on their own experience. If they had been flying a 2-engined aircraft, like the Boeing 777 the British Airways also uses on its long-haul routes, the course of action at this point would be very clear. With just one engine working, they would simply dump fuel and return to Los Angeles. But on a 4-engined aircraft, the loss of an engine isn't anything close to as big of a deal as it is on a 2-engined aircraft. And weirdly, that put the pilots in a more difficult position. Because with 3 engines still working, there was a chance that they could make it to Heathrow. So, they now had a decision to make. Should they continue the flight to Heathrow, or should they go back and land at LAX? To figure this out, the pilots first needed to gather some information. The captain sent the first officer in the jump seat back into the passenger cabin to brief the chief flight attendant, known as the cabin service director, and to look out some passenger windows to check for any damage. Meanwhile, up in the cockpit, the captain and first officer began weighing up their options. The first thing they had to determine was whether the plane would even make it to Heathrow on 3 engines. That's because 3 engines don't have enough power to allow the plane to fly at its normal cruising altitude, where the air is thin and the engines use less fuel. Instead, they would have to cruise at a lower altitude, where the air is denser and the fuel consumption is greater. After programming the engine loss into their flight management computer, it told them that they would arrive at Heathrow with 7 tons of fuel remaining. This was higher than the 4.5 tons which was legally required. So, from that very basic standpoint of fuel, the pilots were okay to continue to Heathrow. But there was much more which the pilots would have to consider than just fuel. What if they had another engine failure en route? Or what if the failed engine began to pose problems out over the open ocean? As the pilots weighed this up, the first officer arrived at a passenger window on the left-hand side of the aircraft. To his disappointment, there was really very little for him to see in the darkness. Some passengers told him that they had seen flames coming out of the engine, and one passenger, who was a pilot, said he thought it had been an engine surge. These reports from the passengers ended up being a lot more useful than anything the first officer could see out the window. Up in the cockpit, the pilots continued their deliberations. By monitoring the engine instruments, they could see that engine 2 was windmilling normally, indicating that it hadn't experienced significant structural damage. There was no indication of a fire or anything else since they had shut off the fuel supply. They also reasoned that if something else went wrong with the flight, it would probably rear its head fairly soon. That was a good thing, because their route to the UK would take them out over the continental United States, which was practically brimming with diversion airports. If anything happened over the next few hours, they could easily land in Minneapolis, or Chicago, or Boston, or countless other airports. For this reason, there was no real reason to favour LAX. And besides, given how heavy they were, they couldn't land back at Los Angeles even if they wanted to. To return to LAX would require them to dump a huge amount of fuel, about 70 tons. That alone would take 40 minutes. And the reality of the situation was that the captain was all too aware that doing this would be a headache for the airline, both in terms of making arrangements for the 352 passengers and financially. Dumping 70 tons of fuel into the Pacific Ocean and returning to land at LAX would cost the airline more than $300,000. For airlines, safety may be the primary concern, but $300,000 is pretty high up on the list of priorities too. The captain radioed British Airways based at Heathrow and asked them to chime in. They said that they would prefer if the flight continued, but that ultimately it was the captain's decision. Company policy dictated that the pilots should continue to their destination as long as the aircraft was in a safe condition, and it was up to the captain to decide that. This was not an easy decision to make. The first officer came back from the cabin and informed the pilots of the situation. When he described what he had encountered, it became clear that in all likelihood, engine 2 had surged, but that there was no further damage. The pilots used their manuals to determine that even in the highly unlikely event that another engine failed at some point along their route, like out over the Atlantic, the aircraft would still be flyable and they would be able to divert to another airport. The captain called air traffic control and informed them that they were cancelling the pan situation and that they would be continuing the flight to Heathrow. Flight 268 climbed into the darkness and headed northeast. 2 hours into the flight, the aircraft was cruising at flight level 270 or about 27,000 feet. It was flying at a speed of Mach 0.75, 75% the speed of sound. This was significantly lower and slower than it would typically fly, but it didn't pose a problem. The aircraft was flying well, and nothing else had gone wrong since the flight had climbed out from Los Angeles. According to the flight management computer, the plane would reach Heathrow with 10 tons of fuel remaining, well above the minimum needed. Most of the passengers were asleep, the strange noises on takeoff now a distant memory, as the aircraft sailed towards Heathrow, pretty much on schedule. The captain had taken up temporary residence in the crew bunks to get some sleep, while the first officer, who had been sitting in the jump seat, took his place in the left-hand seat. The plan was that when the aircraft reached the eastern seaboard of the United States, the captain would return to the flight deck, assess the situation, and decide whether to continue out over the Atlantic Ocean or to divert to one of the nearby airports in the US. If there was any sign of trouble, they wouldn't take the aircraft across the ocean. Up until this point, the flight crew had exhibited an excellent handling of the situation. They had communicated well, they had developed a reasonable course of action based on their informed understanding of the situation, and they had kept the cabin crew and the airline in the loop. But out over the Atlantic, things would start to go wrong. And this time, the problem would not be with the plane, but with how the pilots had been trained. Before the aircraft reached the east coast of the United States, the captain re-emerged onto the flight deck and took in the situation. Given the fuel on board, the condition of the engines, and the estimated fuel at Heathrow, all seemed well for the continuation of the flight across the Atlantic Ocean. The pilots calculated that the most efficient altitude to fly at for the crossing was flight level 320, or about 32,000 feet. The aircraft would be able to climb to this altitude given that it had burned off much of its fuel weight over the US. However, when the pilots requested this from air traffic control, they were told that they couldn't be granted flight level 320 because other aircraft coming over from Europe were flying at this altitude. controllers could only clear them to either flight level 290 or flight level 350. Flight level 350 wasn't possible on 3 engines, given their current weight, so the crew settled for flight level 290. It was a bit low, and when they entered it into their flight management computer, it told them that they would reach Heathrow with about 7 tons of fuel remaining. This was just above what the pilots had decided on as their minimum landing fuel of 6.5 tons. It was looking like it would be a bit of a tight squeeze, but as long as the plane performed as expected, they should make it to Heathrow. All appeared well as the 747 cruised high above the Atlantic into the sunrise of February 21st, 2005. The pilots monitored the fuel in each of the aircraft's tanks and made sure that the extra fuel from Tank 2, the tank associated with the failed engine, was distributed evenly to the other tanks by using the jettison override pumps. This procedure was perfectly okay for this stage of the flight, but it would soon pose problems for the crew. Hours later, as Flight 268 neared the coast of Ireland, it had 12 tons of fuel remaining. The crew had climbed to flight level 350 by this point, saving them some fuel. However, they now had a headwind, and it was stronger than forecast. Their flight management computer was now predicting that they would have 6.5 tons of fuel upon landing in Heathrow. This was the figure they had decided on as their minimum fuel, and the point at which they would need to divert. Reluctantly, the crew decided that they would need to divert to Manchester. They informed air traffic control and programmed this new route into their computer. The FMC gave a landing fuel at Manchester of 7 tons. This was just 500 kilograms more than they would have if they landed at Heathrow, the plane's original destination. But margins of safety exist for a reason, and bending them has led to many accidents in the past. So, the crew began their diversion. As the aircraft descended, a problem emerged. Tank number 2 had stopped feeding fuel into the other tanks. The pilots were already lower on fuel than they wanted to be. The last thing they needed was to be unable to access the remaining fuel in tank number 2. Their situation had just gone from bad to worse. For the second time on the flight, the captain declared a pan to air traffic control. He needed to be given priority to land. The controller cleared him to a point 10 miles from runway 05 left at Manchester. The crew were grateful that they were already descending. Planes typically descend at or near idle power, meaning that fuel usage is minimal. Nonetheless, a warning then appeared on the pilot's central display, telling them that the plane was running low on fuel. Tank number 4 had just 900 kilograms of fuel left. The pilots didn't realise it, but an issue with British Airways manuals had caused this fuel imbalance problem. These instructed the crew to use the jettison pumps on tank number 2, which they had been doing, in order to transfer fuel from it to the other tanks. This was different than the instructions in Boeing's manuals, which said that in order to get fuel to feed from an inboard main tank, like tank number 2, to an outboard main tank, like tank 4, it was necessary to take the aggressive action of selecting both main pumps in the outboard tank off. The pilots didn't do this because they were afraid that doing that would make one of the tanks run dry. It was something they might have considered in more detail if they weren't already busy with the aircraft during the descent and diversion into Manchester. To address the low fuel quantity warning, the pilots turned all main fuel tanks on and opened the crossfeed valves. This allowed the fuel to flow freely between the tanks and ensured that each of the 3 working engines would be fed fuel. At this point, still in the descent towards Manchester, the captain was growing concerned that he might not be able to make it to the airport with the legal minimum of 4.5 tons of fuel. He had not anticipated problems with the fuel balance, and he certainly hadn't expected to get the low fuel quantity warning. This was a far cry from the 10 tons of fuel he was supposed to have had upon landing at Heathrow. Just in case, he declared a mayday, a full emergency, to air traffic control. As per British Airways procedures for an emergency, he took over from the first officer and began flying the aircraft. In the back of the plane, all the passengers knew was that they were diverting to Manchester. In the cockpit, a tense few minutes passed as the pilots configured the aircraft for landing and continued to monitor their fuel situation. The first officer was handling the radios, and the other first officer in the jump seat was assisting the pilots with the increased workload from the emergency diversion. At 5 minutes past 4 local time, Flight 268 finally touched down in Manchester. All 352 passengers and 18 crew had arrived safely. As it turns out, in the end, the pilots had landed with 5.8 tons of fuel remaining, slightly more than the minimum required. But the story doesn't end here. the US Federal Aviation Administration ended up bringing a court case against British Airways, accusing it of operating an aircraft in an unworthy condition. BA maintained that the pilots of Flight 268 operated the aircraft in a safe manner, and in accordance with company procedure. However, the bad publicity which this incident caused led to BA adding one more consideration to the operational factors that the crew and the airline must take into account when making a decision to proceed or divert: the potential passenger and public perception of doing so. If you're wondering what the current handling of such a situation would be today is, BA's then Head of Safety and Security, Tim Steeds, said that under identical circumstances and having discussed the situation with the operations department, a crew today would decide to divert to a suitable airport within North America close to their flight planned route. According to Steeds, the crew would not have dumped fuel and returned to Los Angeles, and further, if the captain chose to continue to the destination, the company would leave the decision with them. The investigation into this incident by the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, or AAIB, found no evidence showing that the continuation of the flight posed a significant increase in risk. However, it did uncover deficiencies in the pilots' training regarding fuel management. The 3 pilots were not confident that all the fuel was available, and their difficulties with fuel management indicated that their knowledge of the fuel system with 3 engines operating was insufficient. As a result of this incident, British Airways reverted to the fuel handling procedures recommended by Boeing. They also added additional engine-out fuel management training as part of their regular simulator training. As for why Engine 2 surged in the first place, the particular variant of Rolls-Royce engine used on this aircraft was vulnerable to a specific type of wear, whereby the engine's internal fans wore away at their casing, causing a disruption in the airflow within the engine. When this happens, engine surges can occur, especially when the engines are at a high thrust setting like they are on takeoff. Today's engines are even more reliable than they were in 2005, and pilots are now trained more comprehensively on how to manage fuel in situations like this. However, the era of the 4-engine passenger aircraft is coming to an end. With all of the new long-haul jets having 2 engines, it seems likely that the decision of whether to continue a flight after an engine shutdown is one that fewer and fewer pilots will have to make.